Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I'm here to read aloud some more of The Kingdom of Books by Orcutt, published initially in 1927. And we're on to the second chapter here called Modern Masters of Typography. So Orcutt writes, "In passing through the crowded thoroughfares of life, I sometimes jostle against someone who forces the unspoken thought into my mind. There is a man I want to know. I make no effort to analyze the impression. If I were to ask myself, I could not tell whether I was attracted to the expression on the man's face, by his bearing, by the frankness of his eyes as they met mine, or by the tone of his voice. I make no effort to analyze, because I recognize that there is no occasion for an analysis. The fact remains that the man possesses a something which attracted me in that single moment of our meeting, and I know that something to be intangible. I sometimes read a book in which the characters step out from the printed pages and stand beside me as living friends. I have turned to the title page to see the name of the writer who could create such personalities, and said to myself, there is a man I want to know. I might not be able to explain to another why this book appealed to me more than did the other 99 I had read, but I do know that it was something which struck a responsive echo in my own heart. When many years ago the knowledge first came to me that type could be made the medium to express the personality of a man, a wonderful new vista of life opened up before me. I had learned from my professors that by means of a brush and pigment an artist could translate himself upon the surface of a canvas, that with a chisel the sculptor could change a rough block of marble into a living, breathing figure, that a composer could make dots upon a sheet of paper to guide a musician in drawing his bow across a manufactured box of wood and catgut strings, in such a way as to force tears or laughter from those who listened, but that a man could put type on end in such a way as to create in me a desire to feel the inspiration of his personality. That was for me to learn for myself. This is what suggested the idea of placing the administrations of the various prime ministers of the book side by side that I might study them. I found that in every case their objective was the same. They all sought to give beauty and permanence to the human thought. They all contended against definite obstacles. They all contributed to the glory of the book. Yet each had to approach it from a different angle. I felt impelled to seek the characteristics and the ideals which made certain men prime ministers, while thousands of others who devoted their lives to the service of the same king failed to leave even their names behind. What is there in the physical makeup of one printed book which creates in me a desire to caress it, while another fails even to attract a second thought? I have found it fascinating to discover, through increasing intimacy with a book, hitherto unfamiliar expressions of the maker's personality as conveyed by means of this revealing medium. For the book is, on its physical side, as Dr. Harry Lyman Cooper so well puts it, a highly organized art object. Not in vain, this book lover continues, has it transmitted the thought and passion of the ages. It has taken a toll of them, and in the hands of its worthiest makers, these elements have worked themselves out into its material body. It has, therefore, the qualities of a true art product, and stands second only to those, such as painting and sculpture, which express the artist's thoughts instead of enshrining it. But no other art product of its own order, not the violin nor the jewel casket, compare with the book in aesthetic quality. It meets one of the highest tests for art, for it appeals to the sense of both beauty and grandeur. Before crossing the borderline which separates the old-time printers from the modern, I like to pause long enough to contemplate the high lights of the various prime ministries, and to fix in my mind the relation which each bears towards those who went before, and what each contributed to his successors. Eldest had the advantage of the basic principles supplied by Gutenberg and the practical application by Jensen, but still I like to give him credit for being the pioneer. It is much to invent the combination of movable types in expressing the thought of man. It is much to devise the finest font of Roman type. But how far would this have carried the art of printing without the dictionaries and grammars of Eldest, or without his practical insistence that the book could be printed instead of hand-lettered and still be held beautiful. Robert Etienne contributed a Latin dictionary, which supplemented the Greek lexicons of Eldis. He gave the world the most beautiful Greek characters ever seen, but they could scarcely have come into being except for the font that Eldis had cut before him. Etienne appropriated the italic Eldis had earlier designed and made use of some of his texts, but in doing so, there was no slavish copying. The Frenchman absorbed and then gave out the assimilated knowledge made richer by his personal interpretation, and he risked his life in defending the high ideals of his portfolio. Christophe Planten made use of everything that had gone before, yet added much to the spiritual and temporal welfare of King Book. He modified Etienne's magnificent royal Greeks enough to make them more practical for the typesetter. He applied the art of printing to the works in the vulgar tongues, and thus widely enlarged its horizon. He introduced business principles, which ensured permanence to the book. He standardized processes, and by establishing so permanent a dynasty, prevented the old ideals from ever being lost. The Elzevers founded the present business of publishing as separate from printing. They contributed little to the mechanical advancement of the book, or to its physical quality, but by their publishing ingenuity, they stimulated a new and worldwide interest. Volumes to achieve their purpose must be read, and to be read must be distributed. The Elzevers, profiting by Planten's earlier efforts, contributed the organization which made book sales possible. Baskerville added much of permanent value in giving out again what he had absorbed from his predecessors. I give him credit for being the first printer who properly visualized a title page. Some of the later Elding titles were comparatively good, but from the time title pages first came into use, there was a universal tendency to overload them with too many lines of type and with inharmonious decoration. Baskerville reduced the amount of matter to the minimum, and in doing this, he set a model for all time to come. Baskerville also gave a new quality to printer's ink and demonstrated how brilliant, well-cut type appears when well printed on a surfaced paper. The Didots were printing books in France while Baskerville was at the peak of his fame, but it was not until the fourth generation that the brothers Pierre Laine and Firmin Didot laid claim to the prime ministry of the book. The portfolio was divided into what might be called the Department of Publishing, presided over by Pierre, and the Department of Types and Printing, to which Firmin devoted his genius. Pierre established his reputation by the publication of his famous Racine in 1801, printed in the Didot type, designed by Firmin on beautiful paper handmade by the Didots themselves. Never, up to that moment, did a printed volume receive the honor of having such scrupulous pains taken in every phase of its manufacture, combined with such manifold improvements in the mechanical processes associated with it, that even thus it did not surpass the masterpieces of Eldis Manitus is conclusive evidence that the art of printing, like Minerva, was born fully armed. I have always believed that without Baskerville, there would have been no distinguished Didot volumes. The Frenchmen were great type founders. They invented the process of stereotyping and in general advanced the mechanical side of bookmaking. When Baskerville so unexpectedly astonished the world by his extraordinary publications, the Didots realized that they had it within their power to establish a lasting fame. France went wild over their editions de Louvre, so called because the government, in recognition of their attempts to emulate the achievements of Etienne, granted the Didots the quarters in the Louvre formerly occupied by the Imprimerie Royale. In spite of Pierre's patronizing comments on Baskerville's work in general, and on his paper in particular, to make such paper is not a secret, and if it ever becomes one, it will not be worth finding out. He paid the English printer the sincere compliment of imitating him in many ways. Even his ink was made from a formula closely matching Baskerville's, but when it comes to press work, the Didots must be given full credit. Even to this day, French press work, the type just touching the paper enough to become a part of it without showing the impression unpleasantly on the reverse side, is the model for the world. One of the most important events during the premiership of the D-Dots was the fact that the King book received an entirely new wardrobe. The D-Dot type, cut simultaneously with that of the famous Italian printer Giambattista Bodini of Parma, introduced a new style which took the world by storm. The old-style letters, which had prevailed since the days of Jensen's Roman face, suddenly became as unpopular as long skirts are today, and the designs of the modern types seemed so securely fixed in the fancy of book lovers that some type founders went so far as to throw away their old-style matrices. There is a distinct charm in the D-Dot and Bodini's types, in spite of the squared serifs and the emphasis given to the thick and thin strokes of the letters. But when the principle established by this design was applied to the so-called modern family, the precision of the characters produced a mechanical effect, which does not lend itself to an artistic page. After the D-Dots and the Bodini, and the new design was not well handled, and printing in general slumped in workmanship and quality. About 1844, Charles Winningham, the younger of the Chiswick Press in London, showed an interest in the history and the precedent of the art of the book, which made him stand out as the only printer of his period whose name is remembered. It was he who was responsible for the revival of the beautiful old-style letters which had been neglected for half a century. The House of Longmans was, at this time, preparing to bring out the Diary of Lady Willoughby, and Winningham insisted that this particular volume called loudly for an old-style dress. With its publication, the Caslon fonts again came into general use, and since then the old style and the modern designs have been retained side by side, each exercising its own function and expressing its own message. After the D-Dots, publishing and printing became still farther divorced, with inevitable detriment to the book. For nearly 100 years, with the temporary exception of the Chiswick Press, all thought of coordinating the elements of a volume was thrown to the winds. A printer was a printer, and only that. A book was simply a larger piece of printing than an advertisement for a lost dog. And the same principles entered into its production. King Book was shorn of the glory of his robes, and cobwebs gathered in the empty portfolio of his prime minister. From a mechanical standpoint, books were well made in certain American and English establishments, but printing was exercised wholly as a trade. I speak feelingly of this period, for these conditions obtained when I, as a youngster, I found myself injected into the making of books, and I shall never forget how dismally I regarded the future as I saw it then. Publishers at that time had not come to realize that it was impossible to build a book properly by a series of contracts executed by different hands. The result was that the printer had little incentive to study historical background or to acquire more than a superficial knowledge of the constituent elements which combined with his own typography and presswork. In other lines of business, clients accepted the idea that the trained expert knew more about his profession than they did, and expected to receive his advice as to the best way to express his own ideas. In the making of books, however, a vicious circle seemed to operate. Because the publisher did not seek such advice, and I'm just going to pause here because we have some beautiful examples. On the left, a century masterpiece. On the right, a modern masterpiece. Some lovely examples of type. In the making of books, however, a vicious circle seemed to operate. Because the publisher did not seek such advice, the printer did not train himself to offer it. And because the printer was not a qualified expert, the publisher did not consult him. Cavilling with a publisher about good or bad taste, once said Theodore L. Devine, that splendid old-line printer of the 1890s, is of doubtful propriety. The printer who poses as an oracle of good taste will be rated, to paraphrase Emerson's expression, as a typographical peacock. 100 years earlier, by way of contrast, John Baskerville received from Dodsley, the London publisher, a plate to be included in a volume the Birmingham printer was making for him. Baskerville did not approve the suggestion and flatly refused to insert the illustration. "If you will accept my judgment and skill," he wrote significantly, "they are at your service today." Today, this attitude on the part of so fine a printer as Devine would seem incredible. He proved himself a thorough scholar and placed the world in his debt for his volumes upon the practice of typography, yet even he refused to recognize printing as an art. No books were ever better made mechanically than those of the Devine press, but the combination of types and decorations were frequently inharmonious. The volumes as a whole lacked that something discovered by later arts printers, which brings their product nearer to the masterpieces of the old-time makers of books. As I now explain it to myself, the conscientious old-school printers represented by Devine studied the work of their predecessors as a series of separate mechanical processes, while the artist printer has always regarded it as a creative whole. They fail to grasp the now undisputed fact that historic background is a twin sister of the knowledge of type, and that familiarity with precedent is an essential complement of mechanical ingenuity. A carpenter may know the characteristics of every wood and be an expert in the use of tools. He may be able to make a splendid colonial window or a beautiful Renaissance door. This stamps him as a master workman. But he will never be a master builder until he learns the significance of what he has done and demonstrates how properly to combine the constituent elements. Again, I find the injunction of the early humanists insisting upon recognition. The builder of books must absorb, he must give out again, but, and this is the vital point, what he gives out must be made richer by his own interpretation. Then in 1890, along came William Morris. When the Kelmscott volumes began to appear, no one associated with the making of books had ever heard of him. When he was promptly installed as Prime Minister to the book by the voice of a hysterically enthusiastic people, the online printers thought the world had gone mad. Many were the sham Kelmscotts, which were perpetuated in America by publishers seeking to capitalize the Morris craze, but, as is always the case in copying without understanding, they emphasized the weaknesses of the William Morris style instead of its underlying merits. I never understood a Kelmscott volume until I became acquainted with the personality of William Morris himself. He was an Oxford man who originally intended to enter the church, but a vacation trip through the cathedral towns of France placed him so heavily under the Gothic influence that he decided to take up architecture. Then Rossetti's work affected him, and he began to study painting, at which he was never successful, although he showed much ability as an illuminator of books. From this, he turned toward decoration and designing rugs, wallpapers, stained glass. Of his furniture, the Morris chair still perpetuates his name, yet what a far cry a Morris chair seems from a Kelmscott Chaucer. What Morris really sought in all these experiments was beauty, and at last the vision of King Book, with all his gorgeous appenditures, came to him. Willing indeed was he to become Prime Minister. Beauty was the slogan of his campaign. Beauty was the watchword of his administration. His type might not be particularly legible, but it must be beautiful. His printed page might be so overloaded with type and decoration as to make it unreadable, but it certainly is beautiful. And the designs, the paper, the presswork are all surpassing expressions of his watchword. Here was a prime minister who had little concern for the proletariat. His volumes were for the fortunate few who could afford to buy them. But even so, the indirect results of forcing the standard so high was to create an average quality just that much nearer to the ideal. Morris taught the world that it was still possible in the midst of diverting modern conditions to preserve unity in making books and to produce volumes which were objects of sheer beauty. The effect of his work is still felt. Certain atrocities in the practice of the 1890s, such as the multiplication of types upon a title page, have quietly disappeared. Printers who had a longing in their souls for better things were encouraged to stand by their ideals, and out of it all has come the great advance in the standard of making books in America and England. Without William Morris, there would have been no Cobden Sanderson, The two men were intimate while Morris was expressing his ideals at the Kelmscott Press, and Cobden Sanderson, then over 40 years of age, was still groping for the proper medium to convey his own, as yet unspoken message. He had tried engineering, reading for the church, and studying for literature, law, had even been a manual laborer. One day, while calling on the Morrises, Mrs. Morris said to him, "Why don't you learn bookbinding? That would add an art to our little community, and we would work together." Morris himself was sympathetic, and in that moment the Doves Press was conceived. Morris had named his own successor to the portfolio of Prime Minister of the book when he would have to relinquish it. During the intervening years, Cobden Sanderson learned the underlying principles of his predecessor's regime, truth and beauty, and as time went on, he came to express them in clearer terms than even the master himself. The Prime Ministry of Cobden Sanderson should rightly be a joint tenancy, for while the Cobden Sanderson bindings could inevitably have won their place, the Doves Press book could never have come into being except for Emery Walker. In America, at least, too little is known of the tremendous contribution to the book made during the past 40 years by this master builder. The Doves type, to my mind, the finest face ever cut, was his design. His association with William Morris gave him a practical experience which made the composition and the presswork of the Doves Press book so superlative, and since the dramatic gesture of Cobden Sanderson in closing the Doves Press and consigning the Doves types to the Thames, Emery Walker has given and still gives generously of his artistic knowledge and taste to other private presses whose books fail to record the debt they owe him. The inspiration Morris gave to printers was vital, but even more important was the educational impress of his works upon lovers of books. Readers in the past have never fully realized how little they understand what the artist printer sought to attain, or that unwittingly they have held him back. Even many of those who called themselves book lovers based that claim upon desire rather than upon actual knowledge of books. There was a reader who was interested only in the contents of books. So long as the print was legible, the physical appearance of the volume concerned him little. There was the self-styled book lover who gained greater enjoyment from his reading if the vehicle conveying the thought from the author to himself was constructed along artistic lines. He knew that the physical appearance and the feel of the book satisfied him, but he could not explain just how it differed from a volume lacking this distinction. Then there was the collector who never read the book but experienced the keenest joy in owning a copy of some title which possessed a value because of its rarity. And finally, there was the happiest of all living creatures, the book lover collector who surrounded himself with volumes rare because of their intrinsic worth and the beauty of their format or the glamour of their association, and knew enough about books to appreciate his treasures. Of these four classes, the first was fully entitled to enjoy his indifference. He knew what he wanted, and he got it, whether it was a detective story or a biography. The collectors were undoubtedly securing exactly what they sought, either intelligently or unintelligently. But those who had not learned the difference between books that are rare because of their merits rather than their defects deprived themselves of the real joy of the quest. Readers still classify in the same groups, but the classification is so rapidly changing that the vicious circle gives signs of becoming benign. Publishers are now taking pride in issuing volumes of distinctive typographic treatment. Assistants in the best publishing houses have become students of the history and precedent of typography, and writers are encouraged to consider themselves creative artists instead of mechanical artisans. And the most gratifying sign of the awakening is found among the workmen. In every bookmaking establishment, there is at least one who handles the type with greater respect because he recognizes each character as a modern talisman, expressing its part in that miraculous transference of thought, or caresses his press with deeper affection because he knows it to be an instrument of God. Think what it means to those men who may not even yet have been given the opportunity for expression, to see the general understanding and appreciation grow apace. The progress has been slow, but it has been steady. Today, the recognition of well-made volumes is the reward being reaped by those few courageous pioneers who have pursued their ideals in the face of apparent indifference on the part of the public and the amused indulgence of the old line printers. I remember 2 incidents in connection with the Society of Printers in Boston, which give an excellent illustration of the attitude of even the best-known printers 20 years ago. A number of us who believed that books were more than type and paper and binder's boards had joined together for the definite purpose of studying and discussing the history and precedent of the art. We met once and so often. We arranged exhibitions and in general did our bit towards arousing on the part of the public an intelligent interest in well-made books. There was a really gratifying response, yet our little society was a source of amusement to the heads of the various old-line bookmaking establishments in Boston. The Society of Printers. One of these men remarked with an indulgent smile, "Why, there isn't a real printer among them." He was right, measuring the printer by the old-fashioned yardstick. Still, we were proud to claim Bruce Rogers and Berkeley Updike as members, even if they were not printers. We would have been pleased to include St. John Hornby, the accomplished master of the Ashendon Press in London, in the same category. While real printers had been studying the case and learning how to trip a press, these disciples of Eldis and Etienne had assimilated the underlying principles of the old masters, had gained an understanding through their expanded experience with life, and since then have given those basic principles original expression in some of the most beautiful books of our generation. Printing as an art has much to be thankful for that men like these brought to their work a knowledge of what the book stands for, an appreciation of the value of applying rather than copying precedent, and withal a freedom of action which has lifted bookmaking out of the rut in which it must have remained had succeeding generations of printers continued to steady its development only within the limited confines of a printing office. Soon after the formation of the Society of Printers, I gave 3 lectures at the Boston Public Library on printing and art. The day after the first lecture, I received a telephone call from the head of still another famous bookmaking establishment. "I see by the paper that you gave a lecture last night on the subject of printing and art." "Yes," I admitted. "Anybody there?" "Yes, the hall was crowded." "You don't mean it?" His surprise was genuine. "Well, I don't quite get the idea. Next time I see you, I want you to tell me what the devil art has to do with printing." So I look back over these 35 years. I am impressed, particularly by the fact that those makers of books who have contributed most in restoring printing to its traditional position among the arts have approached it from without rather than from within. No old-line printer could be made to see that the horizon as viewed over the top of his type cases was necessarily restricted. Morris and Cobden Sanderson were fitting themselves by everything they did before entering upon their life career, not to set type, or to run a press, or to sew a volume, but to create a book. They brought to their task from without something essential and permanent. They approached printing not as a trade, but as the art preservative of all arts, and summoned all the other arts to their assistance. If I were asked to name a single modern volume which to me seems most fully to express the basic principles these prime ministers have established, I would unhesitatingly select the Dove's Bible. It is in 5 quarto volumes, printed in one size of type, with no paragraphs and with no leads between the lines. The only decoration employed consists of simple but beautiful initial letters at the beginning of each book, printed in red. From title page to colophon, it has inspired me as no piece of printing I have ever seen. And here we have a page reproduced from the Dove's Bible, The Perfection of the Dove's Bible. Everyone who has sought perfection realizes its elusiveness. Those of us who have tried to put ourselves into our work must be the first to acknowledge that it is our imperfection which expresses itself most readily. But here is a volume which seems, as nearly as is humanly possible, exactly to express the idea and intention of the men who created it. The text is from the Cambridge University Press reprint of the 1611 edition, which had been quietly and silently revised and corrected until the greatest possible accuracy had been secured. The cut of the type absolutely satisfies the composite definition of the ideal type. The composition is so splendid and the spacing so excellent that when the first proofs were sent to the Cambridge University Press to be read, the readers could not believe that it had not already been corrected. The simplicity of the page itself, the perfection of the margins, the decoration given by the restrained use of capitals, the unevenness of color, the skill of the impression by which the type just bites into the surface of the paper, enough to become part of it, the softness of the paper itself, the purity and beauty of the flexible vellum binding, balance in every detail, giving to the subject matter a dignity and added significance which is a joy forever. Emery Walker is entitled to full credit for the type for the text and for the supervision of the composition and press work. The volumes stand as a tangible expression of the fine principles laid down by Cobden Sanderson in his ideal book, translated into terms of bookbinding by Emery Walker. Incidentally, I may say that my own copy of this last named guide for all makers of books, past, present, and future, has a personal history that makes it priceless to me. I had sought the volume for months without success. When Cobden Sanderson was my guest in Boston in 1908, he may have seen the covetous gleam in my eye as I handled his own copy, from which he read extracts during his lectures, for after he left, I found the book reposing on my desk, with an inscription which made it wholly mine. The Dove's Bible revealed to me what that elusive something was for which I sought. The architects of these volumes that still hold me went back of the history of the art. They became familiar with it, but they discounted the monuments of the earlier master printers. They discovered for themselves the basic principles upon which the genius of their predecessors rested. These old-time worthies put themselves into their work, and so did they. It did not interest Emery Walker or Cobden Sanderson to put someone else into his work, or to try to express himself in someone else's way. The modern message might be more or less vital than the old, but it was his own, and that message, as typifying his own personality, is the something which makes the builder of the Dove's Bible the man I want to know. The prime ministry of the book is so proud a position that it fully warrants the present competition to earn the right to occupy it. The painter who gives permanence on canvas through the medium of his brushes and pigments to some wonderful scene nature spreads before him, or perpetuates for all time the likeness of a beautiful woman, at best displays his genius, but to comparatively few. How much greater is the opportunity for the printer? To him is entrusted that intangible jewel, the gem of thought. Through his creative efforts, it is given a proper and permanent setting. Instead of a single original hung in some gallery, or at most a few copies, his handiwork is multiplied by the hundreds or thousands and is spread before the world. Can such a responsibility be lightly considered? Can such an opportunity be too highly appreciated? Are we not driven to the conclusion, asked Carlyle, that of the things which men can do or make here below, by far the most momentous, wonderful, and worthy are the things called books? So I hope you enjoyed that second chapter of Orcutt's The Kingdom of Books from 1927.